I remember meeting Johnny. I was invited to like some type of after show thing in London.
Yes.
You know, it's like asking a question. How are you doing? But what's underneath?
Johnny Depp was caught off guard when a deaf fan approached him, her eyes welling up with emotion as she started signing. What happened next will bring you to tears. The line stretched down the block, winding around like a coiled spring. Emily adjusted her grip on the small canvas she held, her palms sweaty despite the cool November air. She wasn't used to crowds like this, but today was special. Today, she was going to meet Johnny Depp. For as long as Emily could remember, Depp's movies had been her escape. His characters spoke to her in ways others couldn't, not because of what they said, but because of how they felt. Emily, who had been deaf since birth, had always connected with emotion over sound. She'd watched his movies with subtitles, yes, but it was the way his eyes told stories that truly captivated her. Now, after years of saving, she had traveled all the way from her small town to attend this fan meet and greet. It wasn't just about meeting him, it was about thanking him. Little did Emily know, this encounter would turn into something far beyond what she ever imagined. What Johnny Depp did next will leave you speechless. Clutching her painting, she shifted nervously in line. It was a simple portrait she'd spent weeks perfecting, showing him as Captain Jack Sparrow, but with softer, dreamier colors. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just the way she liked it. The line shuffled forward and Emily's stomach tightened. She glanced at her phone where she'd typed out a simple message in case her signing wasn't understood. "Hi, I'm deaf. Thank you for your work. It means a lot to me." She'd practiced over and over in the mirror, rehearsing how she'd hand him the painting and explain herself. But now, standing among a crowd of cheering fans, her confidence wavered. What if he didn't notice her? What if she messed up? When Emily finally entered the room where Johnny Depp sat, her breath caught in her throat. There he was, leaning back in his chair, his signature scarf wrapped loosely around his neck. His smile was warm, a little tired, but genuine as he greeted each fan. Emily's heart pounded as the line inched closer. She could see him now, the crinkle around his eyes, the faint streaks of silver in his hair. She tightened her grip on the canvas, suddenly unsure if it was good enough. "Next," the assistant called, motioning her forward. Emily froze for a moment, but then she stepped up, her knees wobbling slightly. As she approached the table, Johnny looked up, his expression softening as he took her in. "Hi there," he said, his voice low and kind. Emily smiled nervously and placed the canvas on the table, sliding it toward him. For a moment, her hands hovered awkwardly before she pointed to her phone. She tapped it twice to signal she couldn't hear, then pushed it forward so he could read the message. Depp's eyes flicked to the screen, and then back to Emily. He nodded slowly, taking a moment to study her. "Deaf," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Then he looked at the painting. His face lit up as he picked it up, holding it closer to the light. "This is... wow," he murmured, turning the canvas slightly as if trying to catch every detail. "You made this?" Emily nodded, her cheeks burning. She signed, "Yes, thank you." To her surprise, Depp put the painting down gently and raised his hands. His movements were slow, deliberate. "Beautiful," he signed. Emily's eyes widened. She blinked, unsure if she'd read him correctly. Did he just... Before she could process it, he signed again, a little clumsy but clear enough. "Thank you." Tears welled up in her eyes. She'd come here expecting a quick handshake, maybe a polite smile if she was lucky. But this? He was talking to her, in her language. She nodded quickly, signing back, "Thank you so much. This means everything to me." Her hands shook slightly as she formed the words. Depp's face softened even more, and he smiled, leaning closer. "I've been learning a little," he said, his voice quieter now. "Not great at it yet, but I try." Emily laughed, though no sound came out. She signed, "You're doing amazing." For a moment, the world around them faded. Emily forgot about the long line of fans, the loud murmur of voices she couldn't hear. All she saw was the kindness in his eyes, the way he'd taken the time to connect with her. He picked up the painting again, holding it carefully like it was something precious. I'm going to treasure this," he said. Then, looking back at her, he signed once more, "Beautiful art. Thank you." Emily wiped at her eyes, nodding quickly. She wanted to say so much more, to tell him how much his work had meant to her over the years, but her hands felt clumsy and uncooperative. Instead, she simply signed, Thank you for everything. Depp reached out, not to shake her hand, but to clasp it gently, as if to say he understood. The moment ended too quickly. The assistant gently motioned for Emily to step aside for the next fan. She nodded, still overwhelmed, and walked out of the room, clutching her now empty hands. But what happened next would leave Emily speechless. Keep watching to find out. Outside, she found a quiet corner and sank onto a bench. The tears came then, silent, but uncontrollable. She didn't cry often. She was used to holding things in. But this was different. This was joy, relief, and gratitude all together. As she sat there, replaying the moment in her mind, she felt her phone vibrate. A friend from her online deaf community had sent a message. How was it? Did you get to meet him? Emily hesitated, her hands hovering over the keyboard. How could she possibly put it into words? Finally, she typed back, "It was perfect. He signed to me. He called my art beautiful. I'll never forget it." The reply came almost instantly. "No way. That's incredible. Did you get a video?" Emily froze. She hadn't even thought of that. At that moment, she'd been so overwhelmed that recording it hadn't crossed her mind. A small pang of regret hit her, but it faded just as quickly. The memory didn't need a video to make it real. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Emily wandered around the city, replaying the meeting over and over in her mind. She kept seeing the way he'd signed beautiful, the careful way he'd held her painting. When she got back to her hotel room that night, she pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw. Her hands moved almost on their own, sketching the scene from memory. Johnny Depp at the table, the soft light catching his features, the warmth in his eyes. By the time she finished, her heart felt lighter. She stared at the drawing, then picked up her phone. She took a photo of the sketch and posted it to her art account with a caption, "Some moments stay with you forever. Thank you, Johnny Depp." By the next morning, the post had gone viral. Comments flooded in, many from other deaf fans who shared similar stories of feeling seen and understood. Others were simply touched by the kindness of the moment. Emily spent hours reading through the messages, tears threatening to spill again. She'd never expected her story to resonate with so many people. One comment stood out, "You're an amazing artist. Keep creating. Your work is beautiful." It wasn't signed by Depp, of course, but it reminded her of his words, "Beautiful art." Emily smiled, wiping her eyes. She didn't know what the future held, but she did know one thing. She was going to keep creating, and she was going to carry this moment with her, always. The weeks that followed were surreal for Emily. Her drawing of the meeting with Johnny Depp had gained thousands of likes, shares, and comments. People from all over the world were reaching out to tell her how much the story had touched them. Some were artists like her, inspired by her determination to share her work. Others were members of the deaf community, who related to her experience of feeling seen and understood in a world that often didn't make space for them. Emily wasn't used to this kind of attention. She'd always been quiet, content to live in her small corner of the world, painting and sketching in solitude. But now, strangers were calling her brave, talented, and inspiring. It was overwhelming, but also humbling. One evening, as she sat at her desk sketching a new idea, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was an email from an art gallery in her city. This email was an invitation from Claire Adams, a curator at Riverfront Gallery, offering Emily the opportunity to showcase her artwork in an upcoming exhibit. Claire was deeply moved by Emily's story and believes her art deserves greater recognition and a broader audience. Emily read the email 3 times before it fully sunk in. A gallery wanted to feature her art. She clutched her phone, her heart racing. This was something she had never dared to dream about. The next morning, she replied to Claire with a cautious but excited yes. But what happened next took Emily by surprise in a way she never expected. Over the next few weeks, Emily threw herself into her art like never before. She decided to create a series of pieces inspired by her meeting with Johnny Depp. Each painting told a part of the story, the nerves in the line, the moment he signed beautiful, and the way she felt afterward, full of hope and possibility. Her studio became a whirlwind of activity. Canvases leaned against every wall, brushes and paints scattered across her desk. Some days, she worked late into the night, losing herself in the process. Her family and friends were thrilled for her. Her best friend, Megan, who was also deaf, stopped by often to help and cheer her on. "You're going to blow them away," Megan signed one evening, as Emily put the finishing touches on a painting. Emily smiled, though doubt still crept in sometimes. Would people really connect with her work, or was all this just a fluke? The gallery was packed. Emily stood near the entrance, feeling a mix of pride and terror as people milled around. stopping to study her paintings. Megan was by her side, squeezing her arm for reassurance. "Look," Megan signed, nodding toward a small group gathered around Emily's centerpiece painting. It was the one she'd worked on the hardest, a soft, glowing portrait of Johnny Depp signing beautiful. The emotion in his eyes was captured perfectly, and the painting seemed to radiate warmth. A woman in the group wiped at her eyes, turning to her companion. "You can feel the connection," she said. Emily watched in awe. She had always hoped her art could make people feel something, but seeing it happen in real time was overwhelming. As the night went on, people approached her to ask about her work. She typed responses on her phone or signed when they knew how. Many of them had read her story online and wanted to know more. "What was it like meeting him?" one young man asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Emily smiled, typing her answer. "It was like being truly seen for the first time. He didn't just listen, he spoke in my language. That's something I'll never forget." Toward the end of the night, Claire, the gallery curator, approached Emily with a mysterious smile. "Emily, there's someone here who wants to meet you," she said. Emily frowned in confusion, but followed Claire to a quieter corner of the gallery. Standing there, dressed casually in a scarf and hat, was Johnny Depp. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, certain she was imagining things, but there he was, smiling softly at her. "Hello again," he said, his voice gentle. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. She glanced at Claire, who grinned. "He heard about the exhibit and wanted to surprise you," she explained. Johnny stepped forward, his hands moving in slow, familiar gestures. "Beautiful work. Proud of you." Emily felt the tears well up again, just like they had during their first meeting. She signed back, "Thank you. I can't believe you're here." They talked for a few moments, Johnny switching between spoken words and basic signs. He admired her paintings, taking his time with each one. When he reached the centerpiece, he turned to Emily. "You captured it perfectly," he said. "That moment, it meant a lot to me too." Emily's heart swelled. She couldn't believe this was happening. The gallery exhibit was a resounding success. Emily sold several pieces and received commissions for more. But what stayed with her most wasn't the sales or the attention. It was the connection she'd made. Her story had resonated with so many people, both hearing and deaf, and she realized she had the power to bridge those worlds through her art. As for Johnny Depp, their paths didn't cross again after that night. But Emily often thought of him. She kept the memory of their interactions close, drawing strength from them whenever doubt crept in. She continued to paint, each piece infused with the quiet, powerful emotions she carried with her. And whenever she faced a new challenge, she remembered the way he'd looked at her and signed, "Beautiful." Because in that one word, he'd reminded her of something she'd always known deep down. Her voice wasn't something that needed sound. It was in her hands, her art, and her heart. And it was beautiful, just the way it was. After the exhibit, Emily's life began to change in ways she never expected. Her story and art had not only gained attention locally, but also spread internationally. Social media posts from the gallery night were shared widely, bringing her an outpouring of messages from deaf and hearing individuals alike. People wrote to tell her how much her journey had inspired them. Parents of deaf children reached out, thanking her for showing their kids what was possible. Artists shared how her story motivated them to keep creating despite their own doubts and struggles. One day, Emily received a particularly touching email from a mother. The email was a heartfelt thank you from a mother, Rachel, whose deaf daughter, Lily, felt inspired by Emily's story to start painting and believe in herself. It reflects the profound impact Emily's journey had on others, especially within the deaf community, by giving them hope and a sense of belonging. Emily read the email twice, her chest tightening with emotion. She thought about how alone she had felt growing up, wishing for someone who truly understood her experience. If her work could give even one child a sense of belonging, it was worth every moment of doubt and hard work. She replied to Rachel, offering encouragement for Lily and sharing a few tips to get started with painting. It felt good to give back in some small way. As Emily's art career flourished, she began to consider how she could use her platform to advocate for the deaf community. She started collaborating with organizations to promote accessibility in the arts. One of her biggest projects was working with a nonprofit to create workshops for deaf children interested in visual arts. The workshops were a hit, providing a space where kids could express themselves and connect with others who shared their experiences. Emily found herself thriving in this new role. Watching the kids create with such joy reminded her why she had started painting in the first place. Months later, Emily received a surprising phone call. It was from a producer working on a documentary about deaf artists breaking barriers in the creative world. "We'd love to feature your story," the producer said. "Your meeting with Johnny Depp, your gallery exhibit, it's all incredibly inspiring. We think it could resonate with a lot of people." Emily hesitated. The thought of being on camera made her nervous, but she also knew how powerful the platform could be. After some thought, she agreed. Filming the documentary was a surreal experience. The crew followed her in her studio, capturing her process as she worked on new pieces. They interviewed her about her life, her art, and the impact of meeting Johnny Depp. At one point, the producer asked, "If you could say one thing to your younger self, what would it be?" Emily paused, her hands resting on her lap. Then she signed slowly, her movements deliberate. "You're enough. Your voice matters, even if it doesn't make a sound." But just when Emily thought her journey couldn't get any more incredible, she received an unexpected message that changed everything. The documentary premiered at a film festival a few months later, drawing a mix of artists, advocates, and curious viewers. Emily was invited to attend as a special guest. Standing in the crowd, surrounded by flashing cameras and murmured conversations, she felt a mix of excitement and nerves. The lights dimmed, and the documentary began. Emily watched in awe as her story unfolded on the screen, the quiet moments in her studio, the emotional depth of her art, and of course, her unforgettable meeting with Johnny Depp. The audience was silent as the film reached the part where Johnny signed "beautiful" to her. Emily could feel the emotion in the room as people witnessed the connection between them. When the film ended, the applause was overwhelming. Emily blinked back tears as she stood up to acknowledge the crowd. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. But in that moment, she felt proud, not just for herself, but for what the documentary represented. After the premiere, the director approached her with a grin. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a small envelope. Emily tilted her head in curiosity and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. The note was from Johnny Depp, and it was a heartfelt acknowledgement of Emily's talent and the impact of her story and art, which have inspired many. He expressed his admiration for her strength and creativity, while encouraging her to continue sharing her unique voice with the world. Emily stared at the note, her heart swelling with emotion. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, let alone receive such heartfelt words. She tucked the note carefully into her bag, deciding she would frame it later. The documentary's success brought even more opportunities Emily never anticipated. Galleries across the country began reaching out, eager to showcase her work. Invitations to speak at events poured in, and Emily found herself becoming a voice for both deaf artists and the larger community. But it wasn't just about the art anymore. Emily realized she had a platform to push for change. She began advocating for better accessibility at museums and galleries, working to ensure that deaf and hard-of-hearing visitors could fully experience the joy of art. One day, during a Q&A at a local college, a young woman in the audience raised her hand. She signed hesitantly. "How do you stay confident in a world that doesn't always make room for you?" Emily smiled, her own hands moving with ease. "It's not always easy," she admitted, "but I remind myself that the world doesn't need to make room for me. I create the space myself, and so can you." The audience erupted into applause, and Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment. As the years went on, Emily continued to grow as an artist and advocate. She never forgot her meeting with Johnny Depp, or the way he had made her feel seen in a moment when she needed it most. His kindness had sparked a ripple effect, touching not just her life, but the lives of countless others. And in turn, Emily used that spark to ignite something even bigger, a movement that celebrated art, connection, and the beauty of communication in all its forms. One evening, as she sat in her studio finishing a new painting, Emily glanced at the framed note from Johnny on the wall. She smiled, thinking of how far she'd come. The painting in front of her was unlike anything she'd done before. A vibrant, abstract swirl of colors representing the emotion she felt every time she connected with someone through her work. It was called Silent Conversations, because sometimes the most powerful stories didn't need words. And in her heart, Emily knew her journey was just beginning.